Hey guys, welcome back to the MLS update with me, Mike Rice. Today we are speaking with Peter Galindo once again. Peter, how are you?
Good, Mike. Thank you for having me back on yet again. It's a pleasure.
Excellent. Yeah, our resident Canada expert to go through the three teams once again, leading into the 2023 season. There's been quite a lot to talk about all three of them, hasn't there? Really going into this year.
Yeah, never a dull moment when it comes to the Canadian clubs. That's usually responsible for, Toronto, that side of things. They're usually the ones who produce all the news. But to be fair, all three teams in different ways have made headlines over the last several months now. And it's gonna make for, I think, three very intriguing seasons for each of them. So I'm very excited to see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. Let's sort of start up in the east and go up with Montreal first. So I think they've been one of the ones that have sort of caught a lot of attention with just the sheer numbers leaving to start with.
Mm.
Wilfred Nancy going with Ishmael Kohli having a great World Cup and getting his move, as well as Alistair Johnson. Georgi Mihailovic obviously had already agreed his deal, but now moved forward. And the sheer numbers of players that went has been quite an upheaval for the club, isn't it?
There is clearly the likes of Alistair Johnson, Ishmael Kone, those are massive losses. But what is fascinating is they're bringing back seven starters from last season.
Yeah.
And sure, they don't have Mihailovic, who was a big driver of play last season. They don't have two crucial pieces, one for their midfield, one for their defense. All the way around. But overall, there is still a fair amount of stability. Hernan Losada's come in and kept relatively the same system together, a 3-4-1-2 or a 3-4-3, however you want to
Yeah.
describe it. Victor Wanyama decided to stick around, which I
Yeah.
think was massive
That's
for
huge
them,
for them, isn't it?
especially with all the young midfielders coming through, like Nathan Saliba, like Rita Zuhir. So you're probably going to see yet another wave of Montreal
Yeah.
youngsters, Canadians specifically, that are going to make some headway this season. And so I think with Miller staying, with Waterman staying, despite the interest from abroad, that's going to help them, I think, maintain some sort of continuity entering this
Mm.
season. And a lot of predictions have them outside of the playoffs. I do think they can make the playoffs because they have replaced within the squad pretty well. And even some of the players they do have, like say Aaron Herrera comes in via trade, guys like that are not probably going to start right from the very beginning, because you're probably going to have, I would say, Waterman, Camacho, Miller. That's going to be your normal back three. Lapalainen could be the left wing back, but then Herrera is going to be in a battle with Brogy Yar. He's going to be in a
Yeah.
battle with possibly Chouanier, because Chouanier's gotten some minutes in that back five this
Yeah.
season.
Okay.
The Milevich injury is intriguing because that means Sean Reyes, CPL graduate, could end up maybe taking a
Yeah.
place there behind the strikers and maybe out and out replace Mihailovic, which I think was the plan, but probably not this early. So it'll be intriguing to see what happens there.
Yeah, definitely. I guess, yeah, talk about like you've mentioned there, Aaron Herrera's come in and George Campbell as well in the
Mm.
defense. It's very interesting then to think, like, for most people outside of sort of Canada and Montreal would just assume Herrera will go straight into that team. But obviously they've still got these players that did perform well and deputise for sort of Alistair Johnson when he was maybe moved around and or rotated somewhat. And George Campbell now, another young player who'll get that time with Kamal Miller and Joel Waterman staying, just gives them that time to ease players in to something that people thought would be a brand new team, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and that's, I guess, the good news is that if a Waterman or a Miller leaves, I guess more specifically a Waterman, because George Campbell would probably slide in on the right side of the back
Yeah.
three, at least you have an in-house replacement ready to go. That's not to say
Mm.
Campbell also can't play on the left, but if he replaces one of them, that's fine. And then you just
Mm.
sort of kind of plug and play as you go. But that's why they made the signings they did. They brought in all this allocation money. They've had amazing success with trades within MLS, and even just bringing in players who were free agents and whatnot from within the league, that, you know what, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We
Yeah.
replace certain holes with some of those acquisitions. We bring in some of our academy players, give them an opportunity, a la Ishmael Kone last season. And then maybe you see a Rhea or a Zuhir or a Saliba end up stepping up and carving out a role for themselves in the team this year. So it's all going according to plan. This is how Montreal wanted to do things. This is how the cycle works for them. We're now going to start to see whether they can, I guess, initiate phase two. They've done phase
Yeah.
one and that they got success. They've sold the players, they brought in the money, they made the signings. Now, can those signings actually work out to continue the cycle?
Yeah, that's going to be the interesting thing, isn't it? And I guess looking at those players that you mentioned there, Sean Reyes one that you've brought up, that maybe Miljevic was going to get these minutes, and injuries hit him, so he could be given this chance early on in the season for some more minutes than maybe he would have anticipated. Although I've listened to an interview with Hernan Losada, who said these young players we want to use, we want to get them in. They will get minutes throughout the season, but maybe a little bit sooner than Sean Reyes thought. And watching him in the CPL, obviously that's in its fifth year, so that's still a new league developing. How do you feel his abilities to then move into MLS and progress and develop there, and for other players as well who have come through this sort of loan to CPL system?
Yeah, it'll be an adjustment for sure, but the fact that he did have that professional experience for a couple of years in the CPL and was one of the main players for Valor, I think is going to help him adjust here. And I think also, even more crucially, Miljevic was probably going to be that, well, essentially carbon copy of what Mihailovic was, and that he plays in behind the strikers. He occasionally drifts to the wings to combine with the wing back and whatever midfielder kind of pushes up and just sort of dictates play there. And that's exactly what Raya did at Valor last season and the year before that. And on top of that, too, just like Mihailovic, big threat off set pieces. A lot of his chances created were on dead ball situations. So if Montreal ends up getting set pieces, you can look for Raya to probably take a lot of those and potentially create a lot of havoc out of it. Because I know a lot of people kind of like to look at open play chances, and understandable, yes, but it is still a skill to be able to constantly produce chances off of set pieces as well.
Yeah, 100%, definitely. And I guess like we say beforehand, all these changes, and we were worried about the team. I guess now looking at it, maybe the strike force is the one area that there's still some questions about. The Kai Kamara saga, I guess you can call it, isn't helping what's going on. As much as you may say, my head's in Montreal, I will play, but I don't want to be here. That can't help, I can only imagine. And we're expecting a lot from Kyoto again then in the team. But other than that, is this where there could be an issue for Hernan Losada, do you think?
Unless, say, Mason Toy steps up in a big way, which he hasn't yet done. He's shown flashes of it, but then it seems like he always gets hurt, or certain players like Kai Kamara come in, gain some form, and then the coach ends up leaning on Kai Kamara a lot more than maybe he would Mason Toy. So unless that happens, that might be the one sort of question mark you have. But to be fair, their striker depth has never really been the best in the team, and they've still managed to make do in a lot of ways, right? They still finished second in the East last season. And I mean, obviously they had a pretty horrific game against NYCFC, but for large portions of that game, they were creating chances. They were testing Sean Johnson a lot. He just happened to stand on his head and got NYCFC through. So I feel like it's not too big of an issue, but if there was one area they might want to address, say come the summertime when maybe more targets become available, it's probably going to be up front.
Yeah, I mean they've got plenty of money in the bank now from these transfers and not gone out. So I guess there's that opportunity if the season starts off quite well going into that summer transfer window, you think, oh, maybe an extra addition up front might be able to push us over the edge, I guess. And I guess then also as well, do we see Montreal as the place really in MLS, for Canadian MLS, for young players? Is this a key destination for them at the moment?
I think it has to be, at least for right now. The Whitecaps are starting slowly but surely to filter out their next pro side, their academy team, and starting to give some of those youngsters opportunities. They've kind of taken a lot of flyers on certain guys like Easton Ongaro. They've brought in Antoine Coupland, former Atletico Ottawa youngster, went over to Croatia for a bit. Now he's on loan with the Whitecaps youth team. But Montreal's just so far ahead in terms of their development and their cycle that they're probably the one side you look at and say, yeah, if there's going to be a club that'll give Canadians minutes, young Canadians minutes, that is, it's going to be Montreal. And when you look at the majority of the core of the Canadian national team as well, most of them either have played or currently play for Montreal and have gotten a run of games for Montreal. So they are very much the pipeline, I think, when it comes to the MLS teams right now.
Yeah. Staying in conference, but going down a little way with Toronto is very much the opposite end. They're not the they may have started last season with the
Yeah.
youngsters, but this year there's a lot of old experienced arrivals coming in what is really like the definition of a win now season from the signings they've made.
Yeah, and understandably so. They splurged all that cash on their Italians
Yeah,
and they need to see results. And there were actually rumblings from within Toronto, I think just before Christmas, that they were going to want to make like another big splashy signing, but then budget adjustments were made, and so that didn't
yeah,
come to fruition. So they were kind of told, hey, look, you got to make do with what we have left because we've already spent all this money on Bernardeschi and Insigne. Go out there and do your thing. So Bob Bradley's probably like, oh, okay, all right, I'll see what I can do. And
yeah.
to his credit, they have made some fairly solid signings. I mean, a differing quality. They bring in Adama Diomande, who Bradley's very familiar with, reliable MLS veteran. He's used to playing with stars back from his LAFC days. I think he's the kind of striker that could maybe work with that front two, who like to come inside and kind of dictate play whenever they want to.
Yeah.
So that could be beneficial. Their only real concern is, yes, they brought in Petretta, they brought in Hedges, and Rosted as well to shore up the defense, which they desperately needed after all the departures they had, and even before that, they just were not good enough back there. But if any of those players goes down, that also includes Richie Larea, who's only on loan until end of June. They could be screwed here in a lot of ways, because if one of those guys goes down, they don't really have the depth and quality like the teams they had 5-6 years ago to be able to cope with those losses. So, and considering too, they are slightly older, Jonathan Osorio, Mark Anthony Kaye. If you look at the midfield as well, they've had their injury problems. Osorio's was a bit of a freak incident, but again, he's a year older. He's now 30, 31. So once you kind of pass 30, your injuries tend to pile up a little bit. The Cervania acquisition will help them in that way, but Michael Bradley's really the only out and out number 6 they have. He's a year older. He got stretched a lot last season. That's going to be a really big question mark. I still think they'll make the playoffs, no doubt. Like they can still finish top 5 in the East just based on their individual quality, especially if everybody stays fit. But that's going to be the one question. When those fixtures come thick and fast, are they going to have the depth to be able to rotate and keep the squad fresh? And I don't think they will. That's where they'll drop points and could be a dangerous playoff team as a result, but probably not in that contender bracket quite yet.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like you say, the depth. There's very few players on here that you look at and go, that's a first team player. There's a first 11, a couple of other players that maybe fit in elsewhere. But there's going to be so much need to keep them all fit and healthy, and at sort of mid-30s, quite a few of these players, it's going to be very difficult to do. And with Leagues Cup coming in now, the beginning of this season is quite congested. Got the Canadian Championships as well to throw in there. And does this mean that it's going to be right? Well, let's focus on MLS, and Canadian Championships will play our youngsters. The Leagues Cup will just rest everyone from that as well, and they can all recover, ready for MLS to start again. Or how do they?
that might be the strategy, to be honest, because I don't think they have much choice elsewhere. They've sold squad players like Jaden Nelson, and you know what? Kudos to them, because Toronto's had a lot of issues over the years, bringing through their academy players, giving them first team opportunities, and then selling them and then replenishing that way. So credit to Bob Bradley, credit to Jaden Nelson for showing improvement, because he was a player that was quite frustrating entering last season. He carved out a nice role for himself as a number 8, combining nicely on that left-hand side with Crescito and Insigne. And now he's got his move to Europe, which I think is pretty well deserved. And he's going to get minutes there, you would assume, but that means that you'll lose a little bit of depth, possibly in the wide areas as well as in the midfield areas. So that's where you kind of have a little bit of concern. And also too, there was a lot made about the Sean Johnson signing, and he was highly coveted, understandably so. But you look at the underlying numbers and there is a little bit of a concern. Yes, he does have the odd game where he can play a blinder and just keep your team in it and single-handedly win you points. But he was slightly below average in terms of goals saved above expected last season. Some might say that's due to him playing at Yankee Stadium, but the previous year before that, he also had more goals saved above expected. So you kind of got to find a little bit of the truth in either of those there and balance it out. So that's going to be fascinating to me, especially in front of what is a completely new defense, Larea aside, and a completely new squad for himself. That'll be intriguing to see whether he can actually maybe reclaim some of his old form from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that all works with you. So you've got Sean Johnson, Matt Hedges coming in there as well. Like, how do they're going to need to be on the same page straight away as two sort of leaders in this team that needs so much work from the defense from last season.
No, exactly. Like that's, I mean, and then you have Rosted on top of that, who's also new to the league. If Larea isn't retained, which I kind of have a feeling he will be sticking around at least till the end of the season, then you have to possibly find a right back replacement. Jaquil Marshall-Ruddy's played there in the preseason. He's also played a little further forward at times, just in relief of Bernadeschi or what have you. Sometimes he's also played a bit in the midfield too, kind of replicating that Jaden Nelson role. So that'll be fascinating to see. But him aside, there's no other option there, which kind of speaks to the thin depth that you have at fullback. And sure, Themi Antonoglu could come up from TFC2 and carve out a role at left back. Maybe Kosi Thompson can make some progression this season from last season, what have you. But that would be asking a lot of those players, because you could see last year they went through peaks and valleys, and it didn't necessarily coincide with a lot of success for the club either.
No, they all seem sort of thrown in and do what you can. We're waiting for Insigne last year, and it had mixed results. So like we mentioned, Jaden Nelson got the chance, and we thought he'd lose his role when Insigne came, but he's moved inside a bit more, and he's got his chance. And you mentioned Jaquil Marshall-Ruddy. Like, I mean, we're talking about him as a big possible transfer to Europe. Injury setbacks last year and coming back again. Is this going to be a huge year for him? And in the case of what Toronto are trying to do with young players and developing them?
Yeah, I think it's a massive season, and even just for him personally, because he's had those injury problems. He's been highly touted since he was about 16 years old. And up until now, he's shown flashes of it, but he just hasn't been able to stay fit enough to prove consistently that, hey, I can play at this level. I can make that step forward. And yes, he does have interest from several European clubs to possibly play as a wingback, but you also have to stay fit throughout all of that and continue to show progression. So first and foremost, he has to stay fit. I think if he can do that, he's going to get opportunities here and there, because as you said, Mike, they're going to have the Leagues Cup. They're going to have the Canadian Championship. They're going to have MLS games every 3 or 4 days come the summertime. So you're going to have to give those players opportunities in that way.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. And they've let quite a few players go. Obviously, then Nelson, they've got the fee for Prisos come, and now Jesus Jimenez, another one who would have been a starter, maybe not the ideal centre forward from what they were trying to get, but you would have thought that maybe Akinola would be the player they're trying to move on. Maybe didn't have the interest for him. Jimenez is gone now, so that leaves again less depth in up front. Is there concern about if Diamande doesn't hit the ground running? What do we do there? Akinola's proven for a number of seasons now he can't get a run of form going.
No, and just like him, he's had fitness problems. And it's very telling that over the last couple of years, and I understand he's had the ACL, he had the ankle injury just after the 2020 campaign when he broke out. And then he had myocarditis during the offseason, so that didn't help either. But 2021, he came back noticeably heavier, and not in terms of like, a Romelu Lukaku building muscle and just being impossible to get off the ball, but the bad kind of heavier. Let's put it that way, right? And then he gets the ACL injury, and you're like, oh shoot, how's he going to recover from this? Still hasn't really been able to get fit in that way. He was looking thinner to start preseason, so we'll see if maybe that translates to him being able to gain that quick burst of speed that I think he so desperately needs to succeed. Because the way Akinola plays off the shoulder of that last defender, those first few steps are so important. If you don't have that quickness, then he is a shell of the player that he can be. So it's absolutely crucial that he can get fit, stay fit. And then I think if he can do that, you'll start to see a more productive player like we saw in 2020.
Were you surprised with this Jimenez trade, or is Savania is he needed for depth? Was this we're trading one position for another?
Yeah, I think it's a case of just biting the bullet and
Yeah,
saying, look, we need to upgrade one position. Either way, we got to sacrifice something. And
yeah,
they figured, all right, Diamande and Akinola, which I guess is a show of faith in Akinola as well. This is your team. You're going to get more minutes. Go for it. Plus, they get some midfield depth, which I think they desperately needed.
yeah,
As I said, because if Kay and Osorio go down, at least you got someone in there who's a ready-made, experienced MLS player who's still on the very young side to come
mm,
in and replace one of those guys. But you still have a thin number of options at the number 6. So,
yeah,
I mean, I feel like really it was sort of a pick your poison situation. We got to upgrade one position, but we got to sacrifice from another.
yeah.
I think at the end of the day, it makes sense, but we'll see if that ends up kind of biting them in the behind once the season
Yeah.
begins.
They look like they're going to be a team where everyone's going to be on the edge of their seats for so many different kinds of
Yeah.
reasons
Yeah.
going into the season. Let's go across to the West then with Vancouver Whitecaps, the Canadian champions, and a CCL run to kick off the season. And they're slowly and kind of quietly building a really good starting 11 here with a bit of depth behind it as well.
Yeah, there really isn't a lot you can knock on the team in terms of the depth. Like there are certain pieces that you maybe look at and say, okay, are they good enough to
Mm,
be, say, pieces on a contending team? No, but you do need depth,
yeah,
right? And so if you want to rely on, say, Luis Martins every few games, that's fine. If you want
yeah,
to rely on Russell Tybert every few games, you know he's going to do a job for you. And the personnel tweaks as well as the tactical tweaks we've seen from Vanni Sartini are quite fascinating in a lot of ways, because now it looks like they're going to go more of a midfield three. You're going to have Kubas at the base. You're going to have dual eights with Gressel occasionally filling in on one of those areas, and then maybe kind of operating as like that wing back midfield tweener. And now
yeah,
you got Sergio Cordova who comes in,
mm,
who's very dominant in the air, is capable of getting into quality positions on the regular. And given the amount of dynamic playmakers you have and excellent crossers of the ball like Gressel, like Ryan
yeah,
Gault, I think that this is all coming together. Then you bring in Yohei Takayoka at
mm,
goalkeeper, a position that was easily the weak area for the team last year. They saved 11 goals below expected last season, Whitecaps goalkeepers. That was the worst in the league. So
yeah,
if Takayoka can just produce league average goalkeeping, that's an 11 goal swing
yeah,
in terms of improvement. And that could be the difference between them making the playoffs and not even just that, but possibly getting a home playoff day. Because the West, to me, outside of LAFC, and then maybe take your pick between Austin and Seattle, I feel everything else is up for grabs, as it usually is. So if they can
mm,
just, if they can show that improvement, if those new signings obviously can hit the ground running, I think they can be kind of a sneaky pick to possibly make the top 3 as probably low as 4, I would say, in the West, just based on
mm,
the spine they have established already.
yeah,
With Gauld, with Kubas, you got Laborda in there at center back. Veselinovic has been there for a couple of years. You
yeah,
got the goalkeeping upgrade. You got Gressel as one of the secondary playmakers. Gauld is the playmaker. Cordova is the striker. Brian White is a backup. Like all these pieces are coming together. And I haven't even mentioned Deiber Caicedo, who spent most of last season injured,
yeah.
who's a pretty dynamic piece himself. So
Mm.
and Pedro Vite too,
Vite,
who
see,
showed
yeah,
some pretty big improvements last season
yeah,
as well. So there's a lot to like about the team. They do have the depth. It's just whether, which is always seemingly the case with Vancouver, because they end up kind of turning into a wild card. Can all those pieces gel at once? Because
mm.
they finally, for the first time in a while, got a complete spine from the start of the season, and that could do
Yeah.
wonders.
Yeah, because they're a team that are usually quite active in the summer, and they brought in a lot of these players last
Mhm.
year, and it's didn't quite make it at the end of last season. So but they, you say that they could be a good playoff side, but how is this CCL run at the beginning of the year going to affect that run at the start of the season, and maybe if dropping a few points with all the travel if they do
Mhm.
progress, like I can't remember. I think they're off to Guatemala for the first round.
Yes.
So it's
Yeah.
quite a bit of travel. There's games 2, 3 days later. It's
Yeah.
going to be quite hard to manage for them.
Yeah, and you know what, Mike, is you'll find out because you're moving to the West Coast. It's a
Yeah.
pretty inconvenient place when it comes to travel.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a pretty big challenge for them, I would imagine. It'll be slightly closer to home if they can get through. But regardless, they are going to suffer a little bit, I think. The Champions League will help them warm up, possibly. But as we saw with Montreal last season when they were playing in the Champions League and won a couple of games to their credit, but they also started the season very, very slowly. They had a lot of new pieces come in. They were still getting used to building out of the back, knowing where to position themselves, all those little things. I think Vancouver will probably go through a similar hiccup, but it probably will correct itself, say, come the early spring, maybe mid-spring, once they get into their groove. They have a few games under their belt. There's less travel to deal with. I think maybe then they'll start to gain some steam, but I do think that to start the year, say in those first 6 weeks, they'll probably be slow burners.
Yeah. And they've got, I guess it gives them that chance to rotate though as well, because you mentioned Cordova coming in up front. Him and White, maybe not the most sort of high profile strikers of top teams in MLS competing at the top level, but for their system, it seems absolutely perfect because they've got these players playing off them, like Ryan Gould, Vite mentioned. The home A will probably come out of wing back and get further forward.
Right.
And these players will bring so much more to the table for like the likes of Ryan Gould, who could have like a fantastic season this year.
Yeah, 100%. And you just kind of rattled it off there. Like the depth they have is actually low key quite solid. And for the first time in a while, you know, and I grew up in Vancouver, so I mean, these could be the famous last words as a Vancouver sports fan, but it is the hope that kills you.
Yeah.
And so when you genuinely feel optimistic, that's when they crush you the most. So I could look like a complete moron in a couple of months, and we're revisiting this. You're like, so you were bullish about Vancouver early in the season. They're now 10th in the West to start the campaign. What's going on? And I'm like, I don't know. Like I could very easily see that happening. And yet here I am sitting confidently saying, yeah, they could actually be the surprise package of the league this year.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. I think because a number of the teams go like they're going to be competing in like with a bit of a chip on their shoulder, the likes of Seattle and Colorado as well, who missed out on the playoffs after. I mean, 2021, Colorado were top of the West. Seattle, the first time out of the playoffs in their history, and now they're going up and competing to get straight back up in there. It's going to be really interesting conference again. And of these three sides, then we sort of touched on each of them. Do you feel that they're all playoff teams then?
Yeah, I'll go bold and say yes. I think they are. The Whitecaps, even though they're the one that look to be the most complete side, to me they're the biggest question mark because again, you just never know with this team. Like they're always underachieving in some way or another. They're finding new and hilarious ways to disappoint their fan base. Yet I feel like of the three, you probably say Toronto's maybe the more of the guarantee, just because they have those game breakers. They have the individual quality to win games that they're not necessarily on their day. Montreal is maybe the one you look at and say they finished the lowest just because they did lose some starters. You have some concerns about the striker depth, but you also like, if you look starting 11 for starting 11, them and Vancouver have almost the same tranquility and consistency with their 11 in a lot of ways, but for different reasons. Montreal lost some guys, Vancouver gained some guys. So almost in two ways, but I would say all three should make the playoffs this year. With, I would say Toronto maybe having the best chance of winning a round or two just because they have those game breakers, although with the best of three series introduction, which I am not a fan of, that could maybe change things a little bit.
Yeah, it's nice to see so many changes and organization of the league happening with 3 more days till kickoff. So
that's right. What a time to introduce it. Yeah.
I guess like one of the bits you haven't mentioned is how much Montreal are going to have to adapt to Losada as well, and how he settles in the group. So there's going to be obviously the difference of moving on from Wilfried Nonsi it's going to take some you getting used to, and he didn't have the best time in DC, but he is a fresh new start, and we'll have to see how he gets on with them. But it's going to be really interesting to see. Peter, thanks so much for joining us again. Look forward to the season and reading all of your work following the Canadian side again for 2023.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Looking forward to the next time.
Cheers, Peter.